Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we're plunging into a set of sources you've shared with us. They really touch on a critical situation, maybe even a concerning one, unfolding in Brazil.
That's right. And these sources, they include audio from people like Ricardo Diaz, Christina Grammel, Mario Frias, Jeffrey Cicchini. Plus, we have summaries of their key points. They really paint this picture of, well, growing worry about censorship and where digital freedom is heading there.
Yeah, definitely. So our mission for this deep dive is to try and cut through some of the noise, look at what these sources are actually saying is happening. What are the threats they perceive to online expression in Brazil?
And who do they say the key players are? What's really at stake? That's what we need to unpack from their perspective.
Right. Because as we started looking through the material you sent, a few things really jumped out, didn't they? Specific actions, legal mechanisms being discussed.
Exactly. These sources argue there's like a definite shift happening in how online stuff is being controlled. It's not subtle, according to them.
And they zero in on a specific legal tool, let's say, that they argue is being targeted to make this happen.
And crucially, they claim the motive, the driving force, is tied directly to upcoming elections. So, okay, let's get into it.
So digging in, the sources kick off by describing some pretty immediate actions. What did they report happened recently involving certain platforms?
Well, the materials you shared, they highlight actions reportedly from the AGU, that's the Attorney General's office, Brazil's federal prosecutor, essentially.
Okay.
And the claim is the AGU notified platforms, TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, are mentioned, giving them this really tight deadline, just 24 hours apparently.
24 hours? Wow. To do what?
To remove specific content. The sources mention videos talking about Brazil's First Lady, Janja, and specifically a trip she took to Russia.
Ah.
Okay.
And the sources emphasize something about how the platforms reacted.
Yes, exactly. A key point they make is that the platforms allegedly complied. They took the content down without a court order beforehand.
Which, the commentators in these sources, they see that as a big problem, right? They say it goes against the law.
That's their argument. They point out, normally you'd need a judge to issue an order compelling removal. But here, one source kind of describes it as the AGU just sending a message, basically bypassing that step.
And this action, particularly about content that seems fact-checkable, like the type of plane used, it raises a question in the sources, doesn't it? Like, why erase it?
Precisely. The argument presented is, if everything's above board, why not just clarify or explain? Why the push for removal? And the sources suggest this choice removal over explanation is what makes people suspicious about the motives behind it.
Right. And this isn't seen as just a one-off incident by these commentators.
No, not at all. Christina Grammel, for instance, she's quoted connecting this directly to what she sees as a longer game. She suggests this is the government sort of officially kicking off a censorship push, specifically with the 2026 elections in mind.
And the sources remind us there was that previous attempt in Congress, right? The so-called censorship bill, PL de Censura, that didn't pass last year.
Exactly. So the analysis from these voices is that the strategy has, well, it's shifted.
How so? What's the new approach they describe?
A central argument running through the sources is that the AGU is now going straight to the Supreme Federal Court, the STF, Brazil's top court. They're asking for what are called liminares, which are basically immediate injunctions.
So bypassing Congress entirely.
That's the interpretation in the sources. The stated aim, they say, is to implement censorship measures through judicial rulings, avoiding the whole legislative debate.
And what's the core legal change they're supposedly seeking?
The sources talk about making platforms civilly and objectively responsible for user-posted content. That's the phrase they highlight.
Okay, responsible for user content, but what's the justification given for that?
Well, the sources do note the official justifications mentioned include tackling serious stuff like fraud, racism, violence, incitement. Things most people agree need moderation.
But there's a but coming, I sense.
But yeah, crucially, the sources emphasize their view that hidden within those reasons is the real target, as they see it. Electoral disinformation, and also improper use of AI, specifically framed around the upcoming elections.
That perspective seems quite strong across the different commentators you mentioned.
Very much so. Mario Frias, for example, he specifically names Article 19 of the Marco Civil da Internet. He calls that the central piece of law that's under attack here.
Article 19. And how do these sources explain its importance? Why is it seen as so key?
As they present it, Article 19 is basically the shield. It prevents platforms from being held liable for what users post unless a judge explicitly orders that content removed.
Okay, so it stops platforms from just deleting things out of fear.
That's the argument. It prevents preemptive censorship driven by legal risk. And this is where the sources really get into the potential consequences, the fallout.
Right. What do they predict might happen if Article 19 is weakened or reinterpreted by the STF?
They argue that if the STF makes platforms immediately liable, their default behavior will just flip, completely change, faced with the constant threat of lawsuits for content they didn't even create.
They'll just take stuff down.
They'll likely err massively on the side of caution, remove anything that even might be seen as problematic.
Yeah.
Just to be safe.
Which sounds, I mean, based on these sources, like it could lead to the judiciary becoming the ultimate decider of what's acceptable online speech, like an absolute censor.
That is precisely the fear articulated throughout the sources, and they spell out what that could mean. Smaller tech companies might just leave Brazil altogether. Investment in the digital economy could dry up.
And what about creators, people using these platforms?
Independent creators, journalists, anyone relying on these platforms for their voice, their livelihood, they could be silenced or severely hampered. One source suggests only the huge platforms, maybe those seen as, playing ball with the system, could survive that kind of environment.
It's a pretty bleak picture. And there's also frustration expressed in the sources, not just about the government or the court, but about elected officials, too.
Yes, absolutely. Ricardo Diaz is specifically critical here. He basically says some representatives are just making videos, warning everyone that censorship is coming.
But not doing anything concrete.
But not showing what they are actually doing within their power as elected officials to stop it. The concern raised is that this just puts the burden back on ordinary people to defend their own rights.
Like they're saying, hey, watch out, your online voice is disappearing, but not following up with, and here's what I, your representative, am actively doing about it.
Exactly. And Jeffrey Cicchini, another voice in the sources, he kind of echoes this. He uses strong language, describing the AGU as being at the service of the dictatorship, suggesting it's not focused on protecting public money, but serving what he calls a corrupt caste.
So he sees the move against platforms, the focus on electoral disinformation, as purely political.
Yes, as a transparent attempt to shut down political opposition and control the narrative for the elections, using the judiciary to do it. He frames it very starkly.
The sources definitely seem to feel this is a deliberate strategy for electoral control.
That's the core argument. They suggest that going for a quick liminar from the STF, instead of the slower, more public route through Congress, is a tactic, a way to avoid debate and grab control over online information fast before the next election really heats up.
Okay, let's try and summarize the main tension here, as revealed across all these sources we've looked at. You've got actions reported from the government, the AGU, the STF.
Right, actions targeting content they see as critical or label as electoral disinformation.
And the commentators argue this is potentially happening through major changes to how Article 19 of the Marco Civil works.
Leading to, as reported in the sources, widespread fear. Fear for freedom of expression, fear for the digital economy in Brazil.
So what's really crucial to grasp, according to these sources, is that this isn't just about, say, a few specific videos getting taken down. It's bigger than that.
Much bigger. It's about potentially changing the fundamental legal rules governing online speech, and, maybe more importantly, who gets to decide what's allowed online. The picture painted by these sources collectively is one of a definite move towards more state control over the digital space.
And we also heard that criticism within the sources themselves aimed at elected officials, this idea that they're highlighting the problem, but maybe not demonstrating concrete action to push back.
Yeah, that frustration comes through.
Yeah.
And the stakes, as these sources lay them out, are presented as incredibly high. They talk about the real possibility of platforms just censoring themselves heavily out of fear.
Silencing independent voices.
Exactly. And creating a chilling effect on open discussion that could really change Brazil's online environment. One source, as you mentioned, even uses the phrase Venezuela-style situation to describe the potential endpoint.
It's a very stark warning coming from these sources. So it leaves us with a final thought, maybe a provocative one for you, the listener, drawing from this material. If, as these sources suggest, this whole battle for online freedom in Brazil really hinges on these high-level legal interpretations by the STF and the actions or maybe the inactions of institutions and politicians,
then what role is actually left for the public? How can ordinary citizens effectively defend their digital rights in that scenario? And what does it really mean for the future of how we all access information if these core legal shields for online speech are being fundamentally questioned?